Welcome to Major Antonio's presentation of Stones River, The Turning Point of the Civil War, by Wilson J. Vance. Introduction.
On the banks of a shallow winding stream, traversing the region known as Middle Tennessee, on the last day of December 1862, and on the first and second days of January 1863, a great battle was fought, a battle that marked the turning point of the Civil War. Stones River, as the North designated it, or Murfreesboro, to give it the Southern name, has hitherto not been estimated at its true importance. To the people of the two sections, it seemed at the time but another Shiloh, horrifying, saddening, and bitterly disappointing. Its significance, likewise, has escaped almost all historians and military critics. But now the perspective of half a century gives it its proper place in the panorama of the great conflict. Gettysburg, indeed, may have been the wound mortal of the Confederacy. But Gettysburg was, in very truth, a council of desperation, undertaken when the South was bleeding from many a vein. When Lee turned the faces of his veterans toward the fruitful fields of Pennsylvania, a wall of steel and fire encompassed his whole country. War-worn Virginia cried out for relief from the marchings of armies, that her people might raise the crops that would save them from starvation. Grant had at last established his lines around the fortress that dominated the Mississippi, and only by such a diversion was there hope that his death grip would be shaken. The day after Pickett's shattered columns had drifted back to Seminary Ridge, Vicksburg was surrendered, and the control of the mighty river passed to the forces of the North. But it was at Stones River that the South was at the very pinnacle of confidence and warlike power. And it was here that she was halted and beaten back, never again to exhibit such strength and menace. It was here that the tide of the Confederacy passed its flood, henceforth to recede. Here that its sun crossed the meridian and began its journey to the twilight and the dark. Southern valor was manifested in splendid luster on many a field thereafter, but the capacity for sustained aggression was gone. After Stones River, the Southern soldier fought to repel rather than to drive his foe. Yet Stones River was almost a tale of triumph for the Confederacy. "God has granted us a happy new year," was the message flashed to Richmond at the close of the first day's fighting by General Braxton Bragg, commander of the Army of the Tennessee. 2/3 of the Army of the Cumberland had been hurled out of line and now lay clinging with desperation to the only road from which it could secure supplies, or by which it could retreat, and to lose which meant destruction. There was reason, therefore, in the Southern general's exultation as he waited for the morrow to give him complete success. He could not know that the army upon which had been inflicted so terrific a blow was to gather new strength out of the very magnitude of its disaster, and to return such a counterstroke as would give it the field and the victory. Neither could he see that his failure here meant failure for his cause, that because at Stones River success had not crowned his efforts, his own magnificent army was to be pressed further and further from the territory it claimed as its own, that fate had here entered the decree, against which all appeals would fail, for the preservation of the Federal Union and the death of the Confederate States of America. Wilson J. Vance.
Chapter 1, North and South in 1862.
Confederate enterprise, energy, and expectation were at the zenith in 1862. No other year saw the South with so promising prospects, with plans of campaign so bold, with such resources both latent and developed. Her armies were at their fullest strength, for the flower of her youth had not yet been destroyed in battle. Want and hunger had not yet begun to chill the hearts of her people. Her political machinery, under the direction of able leaders, had been skillfully adjusted to the needs of the new nation and was now working smoothly and effectually. There had, indeed, come a change of sentiment in the Southland. That boastful and flatulent spirit, the spirit that contemptuously slurred the strength and courage of the foe and counted upon an easy victory, was gone. In its place was a temper far more formidable. The South realized now that before it was a task of greatest magnitude, but her people rose to it in a spirit of splendid sacrifice and with high, stern resolution. The early part of the year, indeed, brought a series of reverses, particularly in the West. reverses that would have seemed fatal to a cause less resolutely supported. In January was fought the Battle of Mill Springs, where Thomas, in routing the Confederate forces, achieved the first considerable Union success of the war. In February came Grant's capture of Forts Henry and Donelson, which not only yielded thousands of prisoners but left Middle Tennessee open to the invaders. The same month witnessed the opening of operations in North Carolina by Burnside, which resulted in the capture of Roanoke Island and, in March, of New Bern. Pea Ridge, fought in March, dashed Confederate hopes of Missouri for a season, and the capture of New Madrid proved another heavy loss to the South in men, guns, and munitions. Early in April, Fort Pulaski yielded to Gilmore, and McClellan's great army began its progress up the peninsula, with Richmond as its announced goal. The siege artillery of the Army of the Potomac was still thundering at Williamsburg when on May 6th and 7th was fought the bloody Battle of Shiloh, in which the Confederates, after a striking initial success, were driven from the field by Grant and Buell, with the death of their loved commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, to make more bitter their defeat. The echoes of Shiloh's guns had scarcely ceased before Island No. 10, with many prisoners and supplies, fell to Pope, and the crowning Confederate disaster came on May 28th, when Farragut received the surrender of New Orleans, the commercial metropolis, the largest and wealthiest city, and the greatest seaport of the South. But Confederate prestige, which had suffered sadly in these events, was speedily restored in fullest measure. While McClellan was toiling slowly up the peninsula, Jackson was electrifying the whole South by his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, where, with a small force, he neutralized armies aggregating 70,000 men and terrorized the federal capital. Kernstown, Front Royal, Winchester, Cross Keys, and Port Republic are names that serve to recall some of the most brilliant exploits of the war. His work in the valley accomplished, Jackson then slipped away in June to aid Lee in the battles around Richmond, battles that were to culminate early in July in the retreat to Harrison's Landing and the reluctant and humiliating withdrawal from the peninsula of the Army of the Potomac. While the withdrawal was still in progress, Lee fell upon the luckless Pope and in the Second Battle of Bull Run all but crushed his newly constituted Army of Virginia. Then Lee gave the northward road to his victorious legions, and early in September began the invasion of Maryland. After the Battle of Shiloh, the Confederate forces of the Middle West, under Beauregard, had retired to Corinth, Mississippi, which Halleck, at the head of more than 100,000 men, having gathered together Grant's army, Buell's, and all the other forces under his command, approached with ridiculous caution. After a somewhat farcical siege, in which Beauregard played successfully for time, Corinth was suddenly and expeditiously evacuated, and the Confederate army reappeared in a strong position at Tupelo, when, Beauregard having fallen ill, Bragg assumed command. Halleck now divided his forces again, Buell, at the head of what was now known as the Army of the Cumberland, being sent into Middle Tennessee to begin a campaign long urged by President Lincoln for the relief of the Unionists in the eastern part of that state, and Grant being left in Mississippi, with somewhat widely separated detachments, which ultimately he was to concentrate in the campaign for Vicksburg. The taking of Memphis, June 6, had already given the Union forces a foothold on the Great River and domination over western Tennessee. Halleck was summoned to Washington in July to take command of all the armies in the field. The dispersion of the Union forces in his front did not pass unnoticed by Bragg, who soon conceived and put into execution one of the boldest plans of campaign of the war. Early in June, he began the shifting of his Army of the Tennessee to Chattanooga, where, in conjunction with Kirby Smith, commanding a Confederate army in East Tennessee, he perfected his scheme of operation. The prelude of his campaign was exhibited in the form of extensive raids by Forrest's cavalry and Morgan's, in which the Federal lines of communication were repeatedly cut, huge stores of supplies taken or destroyed, and several important posts captured. Early in August, the heavy columns of Confederate infantry and artillery began pouring through the mountain passes into the coveted territory of Kentucky. Bragg's invasion of Kentucky was thus practically simultaneous with Lee's invasion of Maryland, and the two movements caused the direst foreboding and dismay in the North. The war was coming very close to the people of that section when Confederate detachments appeared in the rear of Covington, in sight of Cincinnati, and when the chief Confederate army crossed the Potomac into the Maryland that the Southern poets had already immortalized in song. Not the least of the objects of these two campaigns was the winning to the Confederate cause of the states invaded. Nelson, with a small Union force, was badly beaten by Kirby Smith at Richmond, Kentucky, August 23rd, and Louisville experienced the agonies of a panic, for it was practically defenseless. Buell had been so mystified by Bragg's movements that he did not start in pursuit until September 7th, and even then might not have reached Louisville in time, had not the Confederate forces lost precious hours in taking Munfordville. But having reached that city, Buell held the key to the situation, and Bragg was forced to retire, which he did slowly and carefully. At Perryville, a portion of Buell's army and some of Bragg's troops met on October 8th in a fierce battle, an engagement that will always be a source of mystery to students, in that neither side took advantage of obvious opportunities. Bragg in this campaign failed of a major object, which was to rouse Kentucky for the Confederacy, though he went through the form of inaugurating a provisional governor at the state capital, Frankfort. But he did return south with long trains of fine horses and beeves, with wagons richly laden with food and clothing, and with almost enough recruits to offset the human wastage of his army on march and in battle. Moreover, at the close of the campaign, he was in the possession of some territory heretofore held by federal forces, territory that was not yielded up until almost a year later. The disorganization in and near Washington, consequent upon Pope's defeat, gave Lee an advantage which he improved by celerity of movement, and he was well into Maryland before a Union army was got together to oppose him. The command of this army was entrusted to McClellan, who exercised his customary supercaution, one result of which was that Harper's Ferry, with thousands of prisoners and great stores of military supplies, fell, with scarce a struggle, into Lee's hands. This very success might have been fatal to Lee, for he had scattered his army to accomplish this and other objects. But McClellan, though fully aware of the situation, moved too slowly, and the Southern general had time to concentrate on the banks of Antietam Creek. Here, on September 17th, was fought one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a battle in which the Confederate army stood off a foe twice as strong in numbers, and at length retired at leisure, without further molestation. Like Bragg, Lee had failed to win the state that he had invaded, but though he had suffered tremendous losses, he had accomplished some important results. The people of the North, it may be remarked without disparagement, were better informed as to the events of the war than were the people of the South. Their more thickly settled territory was abundantly supplied with telegraph lines and railways, and their numerous populous cities boasted many strong newspapers. Of these, not a few were hostile to the administration, which also had to contend with a well-organized opposing political party. To many persons in the North, the campaigns of Lee and Bragg seemed conclusive proof that the Confederacy, after almost 2 years of fighting, was not only not weaker, but could at will practically carry the war into Northern territory. Lincoln, accepting the check at Antietam as a victory, had, September 22nd, issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, but the first effect of this was probably adverse, for the fall elections went almost uniformly against the president's party. The nation's credit fell to a low ebb, and offerings of government bonds found few takers. Only $25 million worth being sold during the year. Gold mounted to high and higher premiums, and general business, despite the artificial stimulus incident to the production of war materials, was dishearteningly poor. Buell, because of his failure to do more against Bragg, was relieved of the command of the Army of the Cumberland, which fell to Rosecrans, who had achieved success at Corinth during the fall. McClellan, because of his failure to follow Lee after Antietam, was ordered to turn over the command of the Army of the Potomac to Burnside. As the end of the year drew nigh, Rosecrans was established with his army at Nashville, and Bragg was at Murfreesboro, 30 miles south. The events of that season were well calculated to enthuse the Confederate and to depress the Federal force. On December 13th was fought the Battle of Fredericksburg, where the Army of the Potomac was repulsed with frightful slaughter by the Army of Northern Virginia under Lee. A week later, the immense depot of supplies at Holly Springs, supplies that Grant had gathered to aid him in his campaign against Vicksburg, was captured. On December 29th, Sherman, in a preliminary movement of this campaign, was hurled back, stunned and bleeding, from an assault upon Chickasaw Bluffs. 2 days later was to open the pivotal battle in Middle Tennessee.
Chapter 2, Foreign Relations in 1862.
The outbreak of hostilities between the North and the South was greeted with obvious delight by the majority of public journals, and with thinly veiled satisfaction by many of the public officials of the more important nations of Europe. Russia, indeed, showed a substantial and potent friendship for the United States, and Italy, where the movement for liberal institutions had already won important victories, evinced a sympathy both general and genuine. But these were the exceptions. In Austria and the German states, the hostile feeling for the American Republic had little effect at the time. The attitude of France and Great Britain was vastly more hurtful. Napoleon III was then at the very height of his power, and his bizarre performances and dreams of conquest had dazzled the imagination of his countrymen to an extent that it is difficult to realize at this day. Nay, more, he had cast such a spell over the minds of Her Britannic Majesty's ministers as to have led to a practical alliance upon certain important subjects. The French emperor saw in the disruption of the United States a vindication of his own usurpation and an opportunity to plant an imperial government under his own guidance in Mexico. In addition, the shortage of cotton, due to the blockade of southern ports, was causing very serious distress in the textile districts of France, so there was perhaps one real reason for the emperor to show some concern in transatlantic affairs and repeatedly to proffer his unfriendly friendly offices. However that may be, his suggestion of mediation and intervention did not fall upon deaf ears across the Channel, though, with characteristic caution, the British government deferred action until its opportunity had passed. French ill opinion could have been borne, even if it had taken the form of countenancing contracts for Confederate ships of war and winking at aid and comfort given to the cruisers of that unrecognized power. But British unfriendliness took a form that, short of actual war, could scarcely have done more to harm and exasperate the government and people of the United States. The recognition of the belligerency of the Confederates, which candor compels the statement, had much in logic and reason to justify it, however it may have savored of technical irregularity, was but the least of the offendings. In plain defiance of international law, splendid vessels were built in British yards for the purpose of sweeping the commerce of the United States from the seas. Confederate rifles and cannon were readily procured from British dealers. Confederate loans were floated by British bankers and oversubscribed by the British public. The sale of shares in British blockade runners to Confederate ports was an easy matter, as it appealed not only to the cupidity but to the prejudice of the purchaser. All grades of publications, from the newspapers to the stately reviews, teemed with abuse of Americans, abuse written in almost inconceivable ferocity and malice. The humorous organ, Punch, did not check its scurrile jester in the drawing of most offensive cartoons of the President of the United States. Practically the whole of the aristocracy was hostile. In all Parliament, but one voice was raised for the North, and that was the voice of John Bright. While the rancor and venom were expended upon the North, and while that section suffered solely from the violations of international law, it must not be supposed that the British press, patricians, and politicians were actuated by any genuine motives of goodwill to the South. Their hope and prayer were for the disruption and destruction of the Republic, in which the nobility recognized their most powerful, however passive, enemy, and the trading classes thought they saw the ruin of their commercial rival. There was, however, one great element in England that was stanchly on the side of the North throughout the whole conflict. And though it did not possess the franchise, this element was not without its influence. the working classes of the kingdom were able to penetrate the mists that blinded their superiors in station, and they saw from the beginning that whatever the ostensible purpose, the actual result of Northern triumph would be the end of slavery. It is at once a pathetic and magnificent fact that no amount of specious argument, such as was frequently addressed to him, that no reflection upon his own sufferings could win the Lancashire cotton spinner, starving, because of the shortage in the great staple of his industry, from the cause of human freedom. It is perhaps too much to say that the British ministry had always inclined to a recognition of the Confederacy. But as the war progressed and its desperate and extensive character began to be revealed, the project of some action tending to this end was frequently discussed in Downing Street. The British Premier at this time was Lord Palmerston, and next in rank to him in the cabinet was Lord John Russell, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Practiced and polished politicians both, they had been able to adjust their ambitions and predilections in this instance to mutual satisfaction. But a third member of the ministry, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave them both great concern. William Ewart Gladstone, whose genius was then being revealed in full proportion to the English public, was too able, too popular, and above all, too formidable to be left out of the coalition cabinet. But it is well established that he was regarded with personal dislike and with professional jealousy by his veteran colleagues. This feeling of animosity was to lead to a most singular consequence, one that had a grave bearing on American affairs. The stopping by a United States warship of the Royal Mail steamer Trent in November 1861 and the removal therefrom of the Confederate envoys, Mason and Slidell, brought the two countries to the brink of war. Only the prompt, complete, and skillful disavowal of the American government served to avert hostilities, preparations for which had already begun on the part of Great Britain. The temper and disposition of Her Majesty's ministry were plainly shown in the truculent tone of the demand framed by Russell, a paper that was adopted by the cabinet, though Gladstone suggested some modifications. However, it would have been sent as written had not the Queen, acting on the advice of the Prince Consort, insisted upon a modification of some of the more offensive phrases. Had it not been for this kindly and sagacious interposition of Queen Victoria, the situation might have gone beyond the power of the Lincoln government to control. The smothering of the Trent incident in the honey of diplomacy left the ministry without an immediate and direct pretext for unfriendly action. But there remained a feeling of irritation and a tacit determination to do something when a proper opportunity should occur. The Confederate successes in the summer of 1862 were convincing proofs to the British mind that the independence of the South was only a matter of time, and discussions of the subject were frequent at the cabinet meetings. Those were anxious times for the American minister, Charles Francis Adams, whose personal luggage was kept packed in anticipation of a sudden breach of diplomatic relations which would necessitate his departure from the court of St. James. Near the close of the summer, Gladstone wrote to his wife, "Lord Palmerston has come exactly to my mind about some early representations of a friendly kind to America, if we can get France and Russia to join." At about the same time, he wrote to another correspondent, "My opinion is that it is vain and wholly unsustained by precedent to say that nothing shall be done until parties are desirous of it," and went on to repeat the former suggestion. About 2 months later, Palmerston wrote to Gladstone saying that he and Russell were agreed that an offer of mediation should be made by Britain, France, and Russia, and that the ambassador at Paris was to be instructed to communicate with the French government on the subject. Of course, he added, no actual step would be taken without the sanction of the cabinet. Lord Russell had but a few days previously written a letter to Palmerston, which had been shown to Gladstone, in which he said, "I agree with you that the time is come for offering mediation to the United States government with a view to the recognition of the independence of the Confederates. I agree further that in case of failure, we ought ourselves to recognize the Confederate States as an independent state." With the words of these 2 letters singing in his mind and mingling with the mental harmonies he himself had conceived, Mr. Gladstone went to Newcastle to partake of a banquet prepared for him by party admirers, and to utter on October 7, 1862, in the course of a general speech, a comment upon American affairs that was to vex him to the end of his life. Said he, quote, "We know quite well that the people of the North have not yet drunk of the cup. They are still trying to hold it far from their lips, which, all the rest of the world see, they nevertheless must drink of. We may have our own opinions about slavery. We may be for or against the South, but there is no doubt that Jefferson Davis and other leaders of the South have made an army. They are making, it appears, a navy, and they have made, what is more than either, they have made a nation. We may anticipate with certainty the success of the Southern states, so far as their separation from the North is concerned." Unquote. It is difficult to exaggerate the profound sensation that this passage in Gladstone's speech made in the United Kingdom, on the continent, and in the United States. There was no escaping its significance. It meant that the British government was on the point of recognizing the independence of the South, and such an act must have led to war between Great Britain and the United States. Aware of the sentiment that pervaded the cabinet, Minister Adams had sought explicit instructions from the United States State Department, which instructions had come in unequivocal terms in a letter from Secretary Seward. Mr. Seward wrote, quote, "If contrary to our expectations, the British government, either alone or in combination with any other government, should acknowledge the insurgents, while you are remaining without further instructions from this government concerning that event, you will immediately suspend the exercise of your functions. I have now, in behalf of the United States and by the authority of their chief executive magistrate, performed an important duty. Its possible consequences have been weighed, and its solemnity is therefore felt and freely acknowledged. This duty has brought us to meet and confront the danger of a war with Great Britain and other states allied with the insurgents who are in arms for the overthrow of the American Union. You will perceive that we have approached the contemplation of that crisis with the caution that great reluctance has inspired. But I trust that you will also have perceived that the crisis has not appalled us." Unquote. Mr. Adams must have perused this letter many times as he waited for the meeting of the British ministry, which he learned had been called for October 23rd, to act upon the question of the Civil War in America. Indeed, he had felt a strong impulse to call for his passports immediately after the Gladstone speech at Newcastle, but had concluded to wait a few days for formal action by the government to which he was accredited. But now conditions and circumstances beyond the ken of diplomacy had conspired to put the inevitable moment indefinitely forward. Whether, as has been suggested, Gladstone in his Newcastle speech had intended to force his colleagues into a position the only outlet of which was recognition, or whether, knowing their sentiments, he had in mere exuberance let the cat out of the bag, he had committed a grave breach of official etiquette in thus speaking without express cabinet sanction. It was a false move, upon which Palmerston and Russell seized with eagerness and, it may be imagined, private glee. Within a week, Sir George Cornwall Lewis, a member of the cabinet, made, at Palmerston's express direction, a public speech in which he adroitly gave the lie to Gladstone. The fateful cabinet meeting of the 23rd was postponed, and a new proposal of Napoleon III that came at about this time, a proposal looking to joint mediation or intervention, was rejected on the ground that the time was not yet ripe. The British ministry kept looking for the auspicious opportunity for several months thereafter. Many thought it had come in the middle of December, when the Fredericksburg disaster was described by the London Times correspondent as a memorable day to the historian of the decline and fall of the American Republic. But on the last day of the year was begun the battle that was to show the British public, what was sometimes forgotten, that there were armies outside of Virginia and territories beyond the Alleghenies. Out of the mists which surrounded Stone's River, out of the uncertainty due to counterclaims of victory by the rival commanders, arose this definite fact: the Northern Army had occupied the town that it set out to take, and the Southern Army had retired almost to the borders of Tennessee, and could not dispute the claim of its enemy to the greater part of the area of that commonwealth. Another postponement seemed necessary. By this time also the leaven of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which at first had been derided, was working in England, and in their turn and time, Gettysburg and Vicksburg aided to produce a much-changed official atmosphere. The foreign minister who, against the law of the kingdom, had let the Alabama and the Florida slip away to prey upon American commerce, was to strain that law a few months later to hold war vessels that had been built for the South. The danger to the Union from foreign sources had passed.
Chapter 3: The Armies and Their Leaders.
The armies that were soon to measure strength in Middle Tennessee were not strangers. They had raced with each other to the banks of the Ohio in the previous fall. They had confronted each other, at times, in fractional strength upon a score of fields. It was the advanced division of the Army of the Ohio, which had checked the Confederate onset on the first day at Shiloh, where Grant was all but overwhelmed, and that command in full strength had done its share in driving the gray-clad battalions from the field the next day. The guarding of Middle Tennessee and the taking of East Tennessee had since then been its special charge and designed function, and in token thereof it had been named anew the Army of the Cumberland, after the river that traverses those regions. The army was composed principally of soldiers from the old Northwest Territory, a region dedicated to human freedom in the Ordinance of 1787. But while Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin furnished the bulk of the troops, there were also regiments from Kentucky and several composed of East Tennessee Unionists. Pennsylvania had sent a contingent, and Missouri and Kansas were both represented. From the regular Army of the United States, there were a formidable force of artillery, a few troops of cavalry, and a particularly fine brigade of infantry. The Confederate Army of the Tennessee was composed largely of sons of the Commonwealth, from which it derived its name, but almost every other state in the Confederacy was represented. A picturesque and romantic element was the famous Orphan Brigade, composed of Kentuckians who fought for the South while their state adhered to the North, and who attested their heroism on many occasions during the war. The two armies were substantially equal in strength, for the Army of the Cumberland reported an available present of 43,400 men, while the Army of the Tennessee, which had the advantage of position, showed 37,700 ready for battle. The Southern Army was greatly superior in cavalry, for this arm of the service had not as yet received in the North the attention it warranted. On the other hand, the Northern Army was greatly superior in artillery. While the bulk of both armies was made up of veteran troops, each had considerable percentages of raw levies. General Braxton Bragg had the advantage, somewhat doubtful in his case, of long service with his Army of the Tennessee. He was a splendid organizer and disciplinarian, thoroughly versed in the technique of his profession, brave, honorable, devoted to his cause, and a strategist of no mean order. But he united a high, imperious temper and a saturnine disposition with a martinet's passion for the letter of military regulation and etiquette. As a consequence, he was frequently embroiled with those near him in stations of authority, officers who did not hesitate to accuse him of finding convenient scapegoats for his own errors. His controversies with those under him form an interesting chapter of Confederate records. It is but just to him to add that there were those that fought under him who testified to warm admiration for his soldierly abilities, and who entertained high personal esteem for his qualities as a man. Bragg's army was divided into two corps. One of these corps was commanded by Lieutenant General William J. Hardee, who had won a conspicuous position in the Army of the United States before he had come to offer his sword and talents to the Confederacy. He was the author of a book of tactics employed in the United States Army long after the Civil War, a system said to have been founded on the drill regulations devised by Napoleon. The other corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, who was Bragg's pet aversion, and who spent much of the next 12 months in writing to Richmond about his superior and extricating himself from the latter's orders of arrest. General Polk had been educated at West Point, but had afterward entered the Episcopal ministry. When the war broke out, he was Bishop of Louisiana, but he speedily exchanged the surplice for the uniform and attained high rank in the Southern Army. He was a man of considerable warlike talent, though perhaps short of first grade. One of Bragg's division commanders was Major General John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who, as Vice President of the United States, had declared the count of the electoral vote whereby Lincoln was chosen president, and who had left his seat in the United States Senate, months after the outbreak of hostilities, to cast his fortunes with the South. Afterward, as Confederate Secretary of War, he accompanied Jefferson Davis on his flight from Richmond and assisted General Joseph E. Johnston in arranging the terms for the surrender of the latter's army to William T. Sherman, terms that were repudiated by the Washington authorities. Other notable figures in Bragg's army were the impetuous General Pat Cleburne, who was to lose his life in the wild charge on the fortifications of Franklin 2 years later, General John H. Morgan, the Kentucky partisan raider, and General Joseph Wheeler, the cavalry leader, who had so managed the rear guard in the retreat from Kentucky as to preserve intact the rich booty of the Blue Grass region borne by the retiring Confederates. Wheeler was one of the Southern generals who later saw service under the Old Flag in the Spanish-American War, commanding a division in Shafter's army before Santiago. Major General William S. Rosecrans was one of the contradictions of the war. A graduate of West Point, he had resigned from the Army and was practicing his profession of engineering when the outbreak of hostilities called him to arms again. He had achieved considerable success in 1861 when, having taken up a work left unfinished by McClellan, he cleared the Confederates out of West Virginia, thereby placing in temporary eclipse the military reputation of Robert E. Lee. His assignment to the command of the Army of the Cumberland was chiefly due to his defense of Corinth during the fall, though he was criticized by Grant, then his immediate superior, for not having achieved greater results in this engagement. As a strategist, Rosecrans was of the first order. Indeed, one of his campaigns still stands as a model for the study of professional soldiers. But brave, warm-hearted, and impulsive, he was prone to lose his poise in battle, as the melancholy outcome of Chickamauga was later to prove. Rosecrans had divided his army into right wing, center, and left wing, for convenience designated as corps. The center was commanded by Major General George H. Thomas, the idol of the army, and probably the most complete soldier that the Union produced. It was said of him that he never made a mistake. At Mill Springs, he had given the Union cause its first generous beam of hope by his crushing defeat of Zollicoffer. In the recent campaign in Kentucky, it was his soldierly instinct that had penetrated the plans of the enemy. His counsel, which followed, led to success, which disregarded led to failure. It was he who, below Chattanooga, was to gather around him the fragments of a broken army, the commander of which had fled the field, and fighting on, was to win lasting fame as the Rock of Chickamauga. It was he who, at Nashville, waiting amid a storm of criticism, abuse, and threats from those higher in authority, sallied forth, when all was ready, to win the most complete victory of the 4 years' struggle. The right wing of the Army of the Cumberland was under command of Major General Alexander McDowell McCook, a native of Ohio and one of the Fighting McCooks, so called, because so many of his family fought for the Union. The left wing was commanded by Major General Thomas L. Crittenden, scion of a noted Kentucky family, which with great liberality and rare impartiality contributed stalwart representatives to both sides of the war. Among the division commanders was Philip H. Sheridan, who later was to defeat Early in the valley of the Shenandoah, and by throwing his columns across the line of Lee's retreat from Richmond, was to furnish the prelude for the final scenes of the war drama at Appomattox. Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, had, after the Battle of Shiloh, been occupied as a secondary base by the Army of the Cumberland and had been heavily fortified. Distant 150 miles from Louisville, the primary base, with lines of communication frequently interrupted by the ubiquitous Morgan and other Confederate raiders, it was difficult to accumulate sufficient supplies for a campaigning army, but by December, ample stores were in hand. Murfreesboro, where the headquarters of the Army of the Tennessee had been established, was an important military and strategic place, as it was the converging point of a large number of unusually good wagon roads and by reason of its location on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. Its facilities gave it dominance over a wide stretch of country, rich in supplies and recruits for the Confederates, and its possession was the first requisite in that movement for the relief of East Tennessee and its harassed Unionists, a movement that had been so constantly urged by President Lincoln upon the Federal commanders in that region. The hearts of those in authority in the Confederate government never beat so high with hope as during those December days of 1862. Mr. Davis and his cabinet, as they surveyed the situation, might well have felt that they had reason for confidence. The principal army of the Northern foe had been repeatedly and seriously defeated and was about to suffer the awful reverse of Fredericksburg. In Tennessee and Mississippi, while fortune had not been so uniformly kindly, there were all the facilities, resources, and spirit for successful aggressive work. While much ground had been lost in the Trans-Mississippi Department, word had lately come that Hindman had succeeded in raising a fresh army in Arkansas, a force that was expected to begin the task of redeeming that state and recovering Missouri. Pemberton confronted Grant with temporarily superior forces near Vicksburg. Confederate diplomatic efforts were at length promising to bear fruit, and the Alabama and other vessels were driving northern commerce from the high seas. New Orleans had fallen, but Mobile, Charleston, Wilmington, and Savannah held out to offer refuge for the blockade runners, which brought the precious military stores into the South. It was under the spell of sentiment inspired by such conditions that the Confederate president paid a visit to his generals and their forces in Tennessee and Mississippi. Bragg felt so certain of himself and his ground that he readily fell in with the suggestion of Mr. Davis to detach some 10,000 troops to Pemberton, though General Joseph E. Johnston, who was in command of the whole department, advised against this course. The presence of their president roused the enthusiasm of the soldiers at Murfreesboro to a high pitch, and many official and social ceremonies served to vary the festivities planned for the Christmas season. There were balls, receptions, theatrical entertainments, and one evening, in the presence of a brilliant throng, General Morgan took unto himself a wife, the ceremony being performed by Bishop General Polk, and immediately left for Kentucky on another of the raids that did so much to harass, impede, and annoy the Union armies. Rosecrans had learned of the detachment to Pemberton, of Morgan's departure, and also had been informed that Wheeler had been sent on a raid. He rightly concluded that the time to strike Bragg was when the Confederate cavalry was absent, and his 3 corps set out from Nashville on separate roads the day after Christmas. It soon developed that, if Wheeler had been ordered away, he had been recalled, for his troopers gave ample notice of the advance of the Union Army, and Bragg had plenty of opportunity to perfect a plan of resistance. Thomas and Crittenden, however, encountered little difficulty on the march. McCook found Hardee in his path, and had to do some heavy skirmishing before he got up. But the evening of December 30th saw the Army of the Cumberland in position about 3 miles from Murfreesboro. In some way, Rosecrans got the impression that Bragg had fallen back and gave orders for entering the town. In the darkness, some of Crittenden's troops began a movement that must have resulted disastrously if pushed, and shots had already been exchanged with the Confederate pickets when the mistake was discovered and the order recalled. Though it had rained for several days, and though the night was bitter cold, the men of the left and center were forbidden to light fires, even for cooking, lest they might betray their whereabouts. But fires were kindled all along the front of McCook's corps and far to the right thereof, for Rosecrans hoped to deceive Bragg as to his exact position. It may be conjectured that this hope was elusive, for Bragg had exceedingly accurate sources of information. Each commander decided to attack on the morrow. Rosecrans planned to deliver battle from his left flank, crumpling up the right of his enemy and taking up the attack with his center in such a way as to enfilade and crush Bragg's entire army. McCook was instructed to resist strongly, but not to attack, except by way of diversion. The position taken by McCook's corps had given Rosecrans much concern, and the night before the battle, at a conference with his principal officers, he had made several suggestions about it to the Ohio warrior. In conformity with the order of battle, McCook's right was strongly refused, that is, bent back, but in general it was too near where the enemy were supposed to be to suit the commanding general. McCook, however, evinced such reluctance about giving up ground for which his men had already fought, and which presented elements of natural strength that were not to be found further back, that the matter was at length left to his own judgment. He, therefore, placed the bulk of his corps in conformity with the rest of the army, which was aligned upon a north and south line, threw back the right brigades of Willich and Kirk, of Johnson's division, so that they, with their artillery supports, faced almost directly south, and placed as a reserve, in the corner thus formed Baldwin's brigade of the same division. The rest of the battlefront, while presenting in general an eastern face on a north and south line, was here advanced, here retired, as inequalities of ground or patches of forest seemed to offer favorable position. The whole Union army was west of Stone's River, though the extreme left of Crittenden's left wing touched that stream at a ford. Bragg's plan of battle called for a heavy concentration of force on his left flank, which was to take the initiative in an attack upon the Union right, and by a grand wheel, with the center as a base, would take the invaders in flank and rear. Each unit was to take up the movement as the battle reached it, and it was hoped that by a rapid, spirited, and sustained attack it would be possible to force Rosecrans back of the Nashville Pike, his sole line of supply and retreat, and hurling his commands one upon the other, accomplish the capture or destruction of the whole Union army. In furtherance of his plan, Bragg placed almost 2/5 of his infantry at his left under Hardee, to whom was entrusted the initiation of the movement. But one division was left under Breckinridge on the right and separated from the rest of the army by the river. The Confederate battlefront, could it have been viewed in its entirety, would have presented a much more symmetrical appearance than that of its adversary, as the comparatively open and level country that it momentarily occupied permitted a more orderly alignment. McCown's division occupied the extreme left, except for some cavalry, and Cleburne's heavy columns were massed almost immediately in the rear. Thus, it will be observed, the rival commanders had, with practically similar conditions to encounter, hit upon practically similar plans of battle. Could each plan have been carried out, the two armies would have presented the appearance of revolving upon a common axis, the right in each case retiring before the attack of the enemy's left. As it was, however, a great advantage, as must be apparent, was to attend that army which should first strike the enemy with its heavy masses in battle array, and the contingencies of the conflict ordained that that advantage should be gained by the Confederates.
This concludes today's reading of Stone's River, The Turning Point of the Civil War, by Wilson J. Vance. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.